The interview started playful until Jimmy brought up cancel culture. What came next? Morgan's tone changed instantly, and what followed? Nobody saw coming. Morgan Freeman had been invited to promote a documentary on freedom of speech. The press release described it as a nuanced look at how language, expression, and accountability intersect in modern society. But behind the scenes, Morgan's team had been explicit. No personal jabs, no political bait, no turning the conversation into a referendum on cancel culture. Jimmy Kimmel's producers had agreed, or at least they said they had. But just moments before Morgan walked on stage, Jimmy flipped through his cards and smiled to himself. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile someone wears when they know something others don't. The applause was warm when Morgan Freeman walked out. He waved once, nodded slightly, and sat in the guest chair with his usual calm presence. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed where it was supposed to be. Morgan spoke about the film. He talked about interviews with college students, veterans, professors, even comedians. He described it all with the clarity and weight that only someone like Morgan Freeman could deliver. But then Jimmy said, "Let me ask you something, Morgan. You've been in Hollywood for what, 50 years? Isn't it true that you used to say things back then that would get you canceled today?" There was a pause. Just a second too long. Morgan said, "I said a lot of things over the years. Most of them with context." Jimmy leaned in. "But do you think you'd survive in today's environment? You've said things about race, gender, power. Aren't you worried?" Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Worried? About conversation? About growing? No. I'm worried when people pretend accountability is the same as censorship." Jimmy grinned. "That sounds like something an older generation says when they're trying to justify outdated thinking." Morgan didn't smile back. He said, "Or maybe it sounds like someone who's been around long enough to know that difficult ideas are part of progress." The audience didn't know whether to clap or laugh, so they did neither. Jimmy kept pushing. "But don't you think some things just shouldn't be said anymore?" Morgan's tone shifted. Steady, but sharper. He said, "Who decides that, Jimmy? The crowd? The loudest voices on social media? Or is it the comedians? The late-night hosts?" Jimmy chuckled uncomfortably. "Well, it's a little rich to be lectured on speech by someone who's never had to apologize for anything." That's when the mood changed. "Now, before we continue, before you see what Morgan Freeman says next and why the studio tried to edit this moment out of the rebroadcast, I need to tell you something. Conversations like this don't usually survive in the final cut. They're trimmed, reframed, softened for mass consumption. But you're not here for that. You're here because you want to see what really happened. You want the truth that doesn't pass through a filter. So hit that subscribe button right now. Subscribe before this clip disappears like so many others have. Because what Morgan Freeman says next, they never wanted you to hear it." Jimmy said, "You sound like someone who's mad the world moved on." And Morgan replied, "No, I sound like someone who lived through real censorship, through segregation, through the assassination of men for speaking their minds. And I didn't spend a lifetime using my voice just to be told now that certain truths are too uncomfortable to say out loud." The audience was completely silent. Jimmy shifted in his seat. "So you're saying cancel culture's a lie?" Morgan leaned in. "I'm saying it's a distraction, a weapon disguised as virtue. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's the same as justice." And in that moment, everything changed. Jimmy Kimmel sat back, still smiling, but the smile had thinned. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was confrontation. And it was clear Morgan Freeman wasn't going to let it be played off as a harmless joke. Jimmy said, "You've always had a strong presence, Morgan. But don't you think there's a difference between free speech and just being provocative for the sake of it?" Morgan didn't blink. He said, "There's also a difference between being provocative and being principled. One is designed to stir the pot. The other is built on a foundation of lived experience. I've earned the right to speak plainly." Jimmy tried to bring the audience back in. He turned to them and said, "Well, I think we all agree that Morgan Freeman is a legend. But even legends need to evolve, right?" Morgan looked straight ahead. "I've evolved, Jimmy. I've changed. I've learned. But I won't pretend the world's moral compass is perfectly calibrated just because social media says so." There were murmurs in the crowd. Some clapped. Some stayed quiet. Everyone was listening, but no one was comfortable. Jimmy leaned forward, softening his tone. "Okay, but what about young people who say they're hurt by certain language? Shouldn't we respect that?" Morgan answered, "Of course. But respect isn't silence. And discomfort isn't danger. Growth happens in friction, not in agreement. Jimmy tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. He picked up a cue card and read, "In your documentary, there's a moment where a college student breaks down crying after a speaker challenges her worldview. How do you respond to people who say that's trauma?" Morgan said, "I say that real trauma doesn't come from words. It comes from oppression, from being told you don't matter, not from being asked to consider a different idea." Jimmy laughed nervously. "So, no sympathy for Gen Z?" Morgan paused, then said, "Plenty of sympathy. But I won't infantilize them. They're smart, resilient, capable. They don't need protection from ideas. They need guidance on how to think, not what to think." The audience started to clap. Not loud, but steady. A few people stood. Jimmy clearly felt the energy shifting. He interrupted, "But don't you think tone matters? That how we say things is just as important as what we say?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Tone matters, sure. But clarity matters more. I'd rather speak hard truth softly than soft lies sweetly." The applause grew louder. And that's when Jimmy's face changed. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, with recognition. He realized he was losing control of the narrative. He said, "Well, I guess you've got the floor now." Morgan looked at him, calm, unbothered, and he said, "I've always had the floor. I just don't always get invited into the room." There was silence again, the kind of silence that lands in the chest. Jimmy held up his hands. All right. Let's shift gears." But Morgan wasn't finished. He said, "No, let's not. Let's talk about why a 50-year career, multiple awards, and a lifetime of storytelling still isn't enough to earn the benefit of the doubt when I speak on something uncomfortable. Let's talk about how easily people forget that I've lived through more history than half this audience can even name. Let's talk about why discomfort gets treated as disrespect, when all I've offered is a perspective forged in fire." The crowd broke out into applause. This time, without hesitation, Jimmy tried to cut to commercial. His voice cracked slightly. "We'll be right back." But the cameras kept rolling. Because Morgan stood up. He took off his microphone, placed it gently on the table, and said to the audience, "You've heard enough of everyone else telling you what to think. Now it's time to decide what you believe." And he walked off stage. No outburst, no dramatics, just a man who knew his worth and wasn't interested in shrinking it to fit someone else's script. For a full 5 seconds after Morgan Freeman left the stage, the Kimmel set stood still. Nobody moved. No music cued. The stage manager froze. The audience sat wide-eyed, unsure whether it was part of the bit or the breakdown of one. Then Jimmy looked directly into the camera and said, "We'll be right back," as the screen faded to black. But the energy backstage was anything but calm. In the control room, producers scrambled to decide how much of the segment to keep. The network team was already on the phone. Some were whispering about fallout. Others were calculating the click value. A few just looked stunned, because no one had ever seen Morgan Freeman walk out on live television, and definitely not on a comedy show. Back in his dressing room, Morgan sat alone. His assistant offered to get the car. Morgan shook his head and said, "Give them a minute. They're not used to honesty in real time." Outside, the story was already escaping the building. Audience members had started uploading clips, short ones at first, just Morgan saying, "I won't shrink my truth for your comfort." Then longer ones, the exchange about discomfort and disrespect. The moment Morgan removed his mic, the silence that followed. The hashtag Freeman walkout hit the trending charts in less than an hour. The show didn't address it. Not that night. Not the next day. Not officially. But the footage told its own story. And people weren't waiting for permission to interpret it. On Twitter, one user wrote, "I don't even agree with Morgan Freeman on everything. But that was power. That was dignity. That was what backbone looks like." Another wrote, "Jimmy tried to reduce him to a symbol. Morgan reminded everyone he's a man." News outlets picked it up with mixed takes. Some called it a meltdown. Others called it a masterclass in boundaries. A few tried to claim it was staged, a ratings stunt. But the rawness in Morgan's voice, the stillness of that walkout, made the idea laughable. Meanwhile, Morgan issued no press statement. He didn't tweet. He didn't post a black and white Instagram square with a caption about being misunderstood. He said nothing. And somehow, that made it even louder. Because in a world addicted to reaction, silence had become the most unignorable form of defiance. Back on set the following week, Jimmy attempted a soft recovery. During his opening monologue, he said, "You know, last week we had a pretty serious conversation with the legendary Morgan Freeman. Things got a little intense. I guess cancel culture isn't just a topic, it's a live wire." Some audience members laughed. Others didn't. Jimmy added, "Anyway, we respect Mr. Freeman and we hope to have him back again." But the offer landed hollow. Morgan didn't respond. He didn't return. He didn't need to. Because by then, the walkout had become something bigger than a viral clip. It had become a mirror. A mirror held up to an industry that preaches freedom but punishes nuance. A mirror held up to audiences trained to cheer controversy but flinch at conviction. A mirror held up to every voice that's been told, "Speak your truth, but only if it's popular." A week later, a college professor played the clip in her media ethics class. She said, "Watch how a man reclaims his narrative, without shouting, without storming, without permission. This is not rage. This is refusal." One of the students asked, "Refusal of what?" And she answered, "Refusal to be reduced." In an interview weeks later, another actor was asked about the moment. He said, "Morgan didn't walk out to make a point. He walked out because he didn't need to stay to prove one. And in that, he proved everything." The studio's version of the segment was finally uploaded 3 days later. But it had been edited. Gone was the full exchange about censorship. Gone was the moment Morgan asked who decides what is acceptable to say. Gone was the long pause before he took off his mic. What remained was trimmed, polite, and sanitized. A patchwork version of events that made it seem like nothing had gone wrong at all. A brief disagreement, followed by an abrupt cut to commercial. But the internet had already seen the real version. Phone footage, backstage whispers, word of mouth. The truth had escaped, and no amount of framing could put it back. People weren't just reacting to the moment. They were relating to it. Comment sections filled with stories from teachers, veterans, journalists, and artists. People who had once been silenced for saying the wrong thing, in the wrong tone, to the wrong audience. They saw themselves in Morgan Freeman. Not because they were famous, but because they knew what it meant to be cornered by someone pretending it was just curiosity. One post read, "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply refused to be baited." And that made people more uncomfortable than any shouting match ever could. Another said, "Cancel culture thrives on compliance." What Morgan did was refusal without apology. And that's why it struck a nerve. Meanwhile, other celebrities began to weigh in, carefully, but deliberately. Viola Davis posted a black screen with a single line, "Respect the lived voice." Denzel Washington, in a quiet moment during a roundtable interview, said, "Sometimes dignity is walking away before they turn your history into entertainment." Oprah, when asked about the clip, paused and said, "That was a moment. And I think people are still figuring out why it hit so deep." The truth was, no one expected it from Morgan Freeman. That calm voice, that measured presence, that voiceover for everything from Penguin documentaries to public service campaigns. He had become a cultural narrator, a safe vessel for other people's messages. And yet, when he finally delivered a message of his own, sharp, personal, unapproved, the response wasn't just shock. It was revelation. Because people realized they had mistaken Morgan Freeman's quiet for compliance. And they were wrong. Meanwhile, networks scrambled to book him again. News shows, podcasts, think pieces titled "The Freeman Moment" popped up overnight. Agents called his team with new projects, most of them designed to capitalize on the firestorm. Morgan declined all of them. Instead, he released a 4-minute video. No background music, no dramatic lighting, just him, sitting at a table. He said, "I've been asked why I walked away. And the answer is simple. I was not angry. I was not humiliated. I was not trying to go viral. I was choosing peace. Not passivity, peace. The kind of peace that says, my words don't need validation to be true." He looked directly into the camera and continued, "There is a difference between a disagreement and a dismissal. And when I feel I am being dismissed, I leave. That is my right. That is your right. Use it." Then he said nothing else. The video ended. And within an hour, it had over 10 million views. But more than that, it started showing up in unexpected places. Teachers played it before class discussions. Community organizers opened meetings with it. Therapists referenced it during sessions with clients who were learning to reclaim their voice. It had become more than a clip. It had become a template, not for how to win an argument, but for how to walk away from a stage that only wants you if you play a part, For days after Morgan Freeman's walkout, talk show monologues danced around the subject without naming it. Hosts made vague comments about how things are getting sensitive, or how some guests just don't get the joke. But everyone knew who they were talking about, and Morgan never responded. Because there was nothing left to say. He had already spoken his truth. And now, the world was responding to it in waves. College professors started adding the clip to their curriculums on media ethics. Civil rights activists shared it at organizing events. But more telling than the institutions were the individuals. The people who didn't have microphones or shows, who weren't trending on social media, but knew what it meant to sit in a room and be told your lived experience was too controversial to be respected. A single mother in Georgia posted, "I work 2 jobs. I don't have time for debates." But when Morgan said clarity matters more than tone, I felt seen. I've been dismissed for sounding angry when all I did was tell the truth. A nurse in Pennsylvania wrote, "I've had doctors talk over me for years." That moment Morgan removed his mic, that was all of us finally saying, enough. It wasn't fandom. It wasn't celebrity worship. It was resonance. Because Morgan hadn't attacked anyone. He hadn't lashed out or insulted Jimmy. He hadn't thrown a chair, broken a contract, or shouted anyone down. He had simply refused to perform a version of himself that made others feel more comfortable. And that refusal landed like thunder. At a press junket for an unrelated film, another actor was asked about the incident. He said, "You know what scares people? When someone old enough, wise enough, and famous enough doesn't need their approval anymore." Morgan doesn't need this industry. He chose to speak. And then he chose to leave. That's power. But not everyone saw it that way. Some commentators tried to reframe the moment as overreaction. They said Morgan misunderstood the question. That Jimmy wasn't being hostile, just curious. But those arguments missed the point. Because Morgan hadn't reacted to a single question. He had responded to a pattern of treating real pain as content, a pattern of reducing full human beings to teachable moments for the audience's benefit. And that response had triggered a conversation that refused to die down. Jimmy's team remained quiet. No formal apology, no follow-up invitation, just a subtle change in tone during future interviews. Fewer boundary-pushing questions, a little more deference when discussing trauma. Other guests began setting clearer terms before their appearances. Some even cited the Freeman clause, a shorthand among agents for asserting a client's right to walk if a conversation crosses into personal landmines. It was unofficial, but powerful. And Morgan? He moved on. He went back to work. Quietly. Without comment. He narrated a documentary about rivers. He sat for a podcast interview about space travel. He even accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award, where he gave a 2-minute speech about grace, not once referencing the walkout. But still, it lingered. The footage kept resurfacing. People kept returning to it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. Rare to see someone stand their ground without shaming the other person. Rare to see someone defend dignity without theatrics. Rare to see someone walk away not to escape conflict, but to preserve self-respect. And in that rarity, people found clarity. One writer put it simply, Morgan Freeman didn't storm out. He stepped out. And in doing so, he stepped into something bigger than himself. Months passed, and the media machine moved on. New headlines, new outrage, new viral moments. But the Freeman walkout never fully faded. It lived quietly in playlists, in classroom syllabi, in hearts that had once been silenced. It became less of a trending topic and more of a reference point, a quiet watermark on how to walk out without walking away from yourself. Jimmy Kimmel never publicly revisited the moment again. His team shifted tactics, softening their questions, pre-clearing sensitive topics more thoroughly with guests. Some saw this as a response to Morgan. Others said it was just the nature of the industry learning to tread more carefully. But among producers, the phrase, "don't do a Freeman," quietly took root. It didn't mean don't challenge your guests. It meant don't underestimate them. Because Morgan hadn't objected to being questioned. He objected to being reduced. One afternoon, Morgan Freeman was interviewed at a small theater by a group of students. It wasn't televised. It wasn't viral. Just a small, thoughtful conversation hosted by a public university in North Carolina. One student, nervous but honest, finally asked what everyone had been wondering. She said, "Mr. Freeman, when you left the stage that night, did you feel like you lost something?" Morgan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "No, I didn't lose something. I remembered something. The student asked, "What did you remember?" He said, "That my voice belongs to me." That moment didn't go viral. It wasn't clipped or captioned, but for the students in the room, it stayed. Because sometimes clarity doesn't come with thunder. It comes with stillness, with the refusal to be baited, with the courage to walk out not in rage, but in calm certainty that you no longer need to stay. Morgan Freeman hadn't made a speech. He hadn't launched a movement. He hadn't built a campaign around the moment. He had simply drawn a line. And then, he had honored it. And in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. Not by yelling louder, not by burning bridges, but by knowing, quietly, confidently, when to say, "I've said enough," and to trust that was enough. Forever.